All right, ladies and gentlemen, how many people were here this morning or were somewhere else at the time? All right, how many of you are here now? How many don't respond to surveys? Okay, good. All right, how many really were not at any of the services where we went through part one? We're not. Where were you? Come on. All right, let's just do a 5-minute overview of what we covered in part one, which was last night here and the services we did this morning, both here and on the West Campus. We started out by talking about Michael Monsoor, who was a United States Navy SEAL, who in 2006 literally dove on a grenade to save his two teammates. He sacrificed himself in order to save his friends. And we asked the question, Michael Monsoor sacrificed himself to save his friends. Would anyone sacrifice himself to save you? And the answer was, someone already has, Jesus of Nazareth. But a lot of people don't think the story of Christianity is true. They think it's invented. And we said, it's got miracles in it, like obviously a resurrection and many other miracles. How could we believe in such a story? And we said we actually could believe in it if we could investigate these 4 questions. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament telling us the truth, particularly about the resurrection? And we went through kind of an overview of these 4 points. And we started by talking about, does truth exist? This is the one we covered this morning and last night. And so let's just do a brief review of that. Now, don't blow this, because a lot of you guys blew it this morning. Remember, we said whenever you start talking about truth, you always have to start with Jack Nicholson, all right? Because Tom Cruise had a month. Let me remind you how he said it. Let me just remind you. Here's how he said it.
I want the truth. You can't handle the truth.
All right, let's try it. I want the truth. All right, good. You're quick learners. And we said there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth because they're saying, things like, you got your truth, I got my truth, all truth is relative, right? You ought not judge, all these claims. And we pointed out that when people make claims like this, you ought to turn the claim on itself. So if someone says there's no truth, you're going to ask the question, is that true, right? Because it's actually a self-defeating statement. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. And we said the thinking skill that you got to get good at using is to turn the claim on itself. And we did a number of these this morning and last night, where when people say all truth is relative, we're going to ask the question, is that a relative truth? If somebody says there are no absolutes, we're going to ask, are you absolutely sure? That's an absolute truth claim. If somebody says you ought not judge, you're going to say, then why are you judging me for judging? See, that's a judgment. We went through all these self-defeating statements. And the bottom line was that this statement right here shoots itself. You remember we talked about this? Which means relativism and postmodernism are false because they claim it's true that there is no truth. And we said you really got to get good at turning claims on themselves so you can avoid believing things that are false. And there are so many false philosophies and false statements you'll hear in our culture. And you don't want to live by those, because if you do, eventually you're going to smack up against reality and it's going to hurt you and probably a lot of other people. So we said that truth does exist. It's self-defeating to say it doesn't. The next question was, is it true that God exists? Okay, that's the 3-minute summary of what we did this morning and last night. You guys ready to go to the next phase? All right, good. By the way, before we move off truth, I probably should define what truth is. Truth is what corresponds to reality. If I say this is a bottle of water, that would be true. If I'd say it's a bottle of vodka, it wouldn't be true. Well, you don't know whether or not it's a bottle of vodka, do you? You don't know it. But no, it's a bottle of water, right? Truth is telling it like it is. If I say here we are in Tucson, Arizona, that would be telling it like it is. If I would say here we are in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live, that wouldn't be telling it like it is, all right? Is it true, that God exists? A God beyond the world who created and sustains the world. And as I mentioned this morning, that there are 3 arguments for the existence of God that we are going to look at. There are more than 3, but these are the only 3 we're going to look at. The first argument is from the beginning of the universe. This is technically known as the cosmological argument. Now, cosmological comes from the Greek word, excuse me, man, what a time to get the tickle in the throat. Talk awkwardly amongst yourselves. It is true. I have a tickle in my throat. Cosmological comes from the Greek word cosmos, which means world or universe. And it says if the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a beginner. The second argument is the argument from design. This is technically known as the teleological argument. And telos is a Greek word meaning design or purpose. So if there's design in the universe and design in you, life, there must be a designer. Now, these two arguments have some scientific evidence behind them. We'll get to that. The third argument doesn't have any science behind it. It's more philosophical in nature, yet it's the argument you've all intuitively understood since you were a very small child. It's the argument from morality known as the moral argument. And it says that there's one thing morally wrong out there, just one. Like, it's wrong to torture babies for fun. Or it's wrong to rape and murder innocent human beings, like what happened in Israel just 2 months ago. Or it's wrong to murder 6 million Jews. Then there has to be a God. Why? Because if there is no standard beyond humanity, then everything's just a matter of opinion. That would just be your opinion against a baby torturer's opinion, or your opinion against Hamas's opinion, or your opinion against Hitler's opinion. Well, we know that rape, torture, and murder aren't just matters of opinion. If that's the case, there must be a standard of righteousness outside of ourselves that we're obligated to obey. That standard is what we mean by God's nature. If God doesn't exist, you can't say any of those things are really wrong. It would just be your opinion. But we know they're wrong, so there must be a standard of really right. We'll get to that later, but we got to start right here at the cosmological argument. You got to admit it was worth coming here tonight just to see God do that. Did you see that? Some of you said, I've never seen God move. Oh, really? Check this out. Now, this is the argument that many say points back to the big... Now, I know there's some Christians in here going, Frank, we're Christians in here, and we don't believe in the Big Bang. You guys don't believe in the Big Bang? I believe in the Big Bang. I just know who banged it. In fact, the evidence for the Big Bang is so good that even atheistic scientists are admitting it. Probably the most famous was Stephen Hawking, who was the most famous physicist in the world until he died about 6 years ago. And Hawking, despite being an atheist, said this: almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Now, Hawking tried to come up with another explanation other than God. He failed, but he's admitting the data, that space, time, and matter literally came into existence out of non-being, out of nothing. Once there was nothing, and then suddenly this universe came into existence. We'll see the implications of that here in a minute. Now, we're not going to go through the evidence for this here tonight. Why? Number one, we don't have time. Number two, it's all in the book, chapter 3. Number three, it's not controversial. Even the atheists are admitting the universe had a beginning. Nobody's really disputing that. It's not whether or not the universe had a beginning. What's controversial is what caused the universe to have a beginning. We'll get to that in a minute. I do want to show you one piece of philosophical argumentation that I think shows without any doubt that the universe had a beginning. I mean, the science shows it too, but you don't need the science to know this. Let's take a look at this timeline here for a second. There's the present right there. There's yesterday. There's the day before yesterday. There's last week, right? Let's say we don't know how far back this timeline goes. Here's my question. Can this timeline be infinite into the past? This is the interactive portion of the program. Why can't it be? Because if there were an infinite number of days before today, this day never would have gotten here. Why? Because you'd always have to live another day before you got to today. Why? Because there's an infinite number of days before today. You following me? So there's got to be only a finite number of days before today. In other words, time must have had a beginning. You see, if the past were infinite, today never would have arrived. But here we are. That means whatever created time must be timeless. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're timeless, do you have a beginning yourself? No. This answers the question. If this is God who created this, he doesn't have a beginning. He doesn't have a cause. This answers the question, who created God? Nobody. He's the uncaused first cause. He's outside of time. He created time. Now, there's a lot more in the book on that, but let's just cut to the bottom line. If the universe did have a beginning, as science and philosophy seems to show, we've got two options. Either no one created something out of nothing, which is the atheistic view, or someone created something out of nothing, which is the theistic view. Now, here's my only question. Which view is more reasonable? That no one created something out of nothing, or someone created something out of nothing? What do you think? Yeah, obviously number two. Number two is a miracle, but you got someone doing the miracle, right? Number one is a miracle as well, but you got no one doing it. Do you realize that everyone believes in at least one miracle? Christians believe in this miracle and several others. Atheists believe in one miracle. They believe that no one created something out of nothing. Now, which takes more faith? That someone created something out of nothing, or no one created something? What do you think? Yeah, no one. Literally, there are atheists today who are trying to say that the universe just came into existence out of nothing by nothing. Nobody created it. Well, if that's the case, if the whole universe could come into existence out of nothing by nothing, why doesn't everything do so? Why don't Teslas pop into existence out of nothing by nothing? You wake up one morning, you look in your driveway, your Hyundai is a Tesla. You go, how do I charge this thing? Why don't MacBook Pros pop into existence out of nothing by nothing without a cause? Could have saved me $3,000. If after this little seminar here, you're hungry, you want to have a pizza, does it make sense to order one? Or should you just sit in your kitchen, wait, and hope one pops into existence out of nothing by nothing without a cause? No, it's the atheists that have all the faith, not the Christians. In fact, here's a question to ask an atheist. If there is no God, why is there something rather than nothing at all? In other words, if there is no God, why does anything exist? Why does the universe exist? Why do trees exist? Why do you exist? Why does carbon exist? Why do the Dallas Cowboys exist? I mean, sure sign that Satan is alive and well. Anyway, I'm from New Jersey, all right? No, really, why is there something rather than nothing if there is no God? Now, ladies and gentlemen, if space-time and matter had a beginning out of nothing, which even atheists are admitting, ask yourself, what could have caused that? Only something outside of space-time and matter, because space-time and matter didn't exist. In other words, only something outside of nature, something beyond nature. The cause must be spaceless, because it created space. Timeless, because it created time. Immaterial, because it created material. Must be intelligent in order to create, as we'll see here, this very precise creation. Must be personal in order to choose to create. Also must be powerful to create the universe out of nothing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent cause, who do you think of? God. You say, well, how do you know this is the Christian God, Frank? We don't yet. I mean, this could be Allah or some other theistic God. We don't know yet. But if we keep going through the evidence and we see that miracles are possible and we see that Jesus rose from the dead, then we can say that the same being that walked out of the tomb 1,990 years ago is the same being in whose divine nature created the universe out of nothing. We haven't gotten there yet. We just know this could be the Christian God. But no scientific argument is going to get you all the way to Jesus. You've got to look at historical data to see if Jesus is truly God. But you can see that there is a creator here. If there's a creator, or I should say if there's a creation, there must be a creator. All right, that's the first argument. Let's look at the second argument, the design argument. Now, there are two aspects to this. The universe appears to be designed, and life, appears to be designed. We're going to look at the universe first. Scientists have discovered in recent decades that the universe is precisely fine-tuned for life to exist here on Earth. If you were to change any one of a number of factors about our universe, virtually imperceptibly, there would be no universe, or certainly no universe that could support life. And even atheists admit this. Again, Stephen Hawking famously said this: if the expansion rate of the universe was different by 1 part in 1,000 million a second after the Big Bang, the universe would have collapsed back on itself or never developed galaxies. In other words, if the expansion rate was that infinitesimally different at the very beginning, nothing would be here. Now, what could have caused that expansion rate to be precisely what it needed to be? You can't come up with any sort of evolutionary explanation. Why? Because the expansion rate didn't evolve to a certain rate by chance, whatever that means. The expansion rate started at the right point from the very beginning. Seems to me the same being that created space-time and matter is the same being that fine-tuned the expansion rate to be precisely what it needed to be so we could even be sitting here tonight. Also, the gravitational force, if it were altered by more than 1 part in 10 to the 40th power compared to the strong nuclear force, we wouldn't exist. What's 1 part in 10 to the 40th power? That's 1 part in 1 with 40 zeros following it. You say, Frank, I can't get my head around that number. I know, neither can I, so let me give you an illustration. Take the entire North American continent from Central America all the way to Greenland, and stack it in dimes all the way to the moon. That's 238,000 miles. And then do that on 1 billion other North American continents. Stack it in dimes all the way to the moon. Then take all those pile of dimes, put them in one big pile, mark 1 dime red, mix it in, blindfold a friend, throw him on the pile, ask him to pick 1 dime at random. The chances he would pick that 1 red dime is 1 chance in 10 to the 40th power. Is he going to pick that 1 dime? No. You got to have a lot of faith to believe he's going to pick that 1 dime. Not going to happen. And this is just one out of at least a dozen of these parameters. Change any one of them, imperceptibly, the universe doesn't support life. And then if you look at our solar system, there's about 100 factors about our solar system that if they were any different, we wouldn't be here. In fact, let's take a look at our solar system here for a second. Here we are, 3rd rock from the sun. If we were just a little bit closer to or a little bit further away, we couldn't survive. A little bit closer to, we'd burn up. A little bit further away, we'd freeze. We are what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It is... That's a lie. It's way too hot here in the summer. I mean, come on. The axial tilt, 23.5 degrees. Change that slightly, we don't exist. Earth rotation, 24 hours. Change that slightly, we don't exist. The size and distance of the moon from us. Change that slightly, we don't exist. If Jupiter was not in its current orbit, we couldn't exist here on Earth. Why? What does Jupiter do for us? Jupiter's gravitational force is so strong that it attracts most of the meteors and space junk to it rather than us. It's a cosmic vacuum cleaner. In fact, if you take a close-up look at Jupiter, you see these dark marks? Those are comet fragment strikes that are bigger than the Earth. Thank God for Jupiter. Because if Jupiter wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. Same thing is true with Saturn. In fact, you want to see the planet size? Check this out. This is in order of size. Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, Neptune, Earth. Look at poor Pluto down here. You know, Pluto recently has been demoted as a planet. I don't know about you, but I think it's size discrimination. And what if Pluto identifies as a planet? What then? You bigots. Take a look at this. You can hardly see Pluto. Take a look at this. Okay, that's Arcturus. That's another star in our galaxy. Here's the sun. Jupiter is 1 pixel in size on this scale. Earth is invisible. Pluto, forget about it. All right, keep an eye on Arcturus now. Where's Arcturus now? Way over here. See it? That's Antares. That's another star in our galaxy. The sun is 1 pixel in size on this scale. Jupiter is invisible. Earth, Pluto, forget about it. In fact, if the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Betelgeuse here, look, I don't name the stars, okay? If the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Betelgeuse would be 5 or 6 Empire State Buildings high. The heavens are awesome. And this is just in our galaxy. It's not outside our galaxy, it's inside our galaxy. And the average distance between stars in our galaxy is 30 trillion miles. And all that distance is necessary for us to exist here on Earth. Now, 30 trillion miles, how far is that? Far. It'll take you at least 2 tanks of gas in a Toyota Prius to go 30 trillion miles. You know, a number of years ago, my in-laws used to live off Ina up that way, kind of like northwest of here. Maybe about 25 years ago, we were here and we took our 3 sons to the Desert Museum. You guys know where the Desert Museum is, right over the hill over there. And we're out there one night and the guide says, wow, it's so clear tonight that if we look up at 9:03, we'll see the space shuttle in orbit. I said, oh, come on. We're not going to see the space shuttle in orbit. I mean, it's only 125 feet long. It's 350 miles up. We're not going to see it. Oh, me of little faith. At 9:03, the guide goes, look! And we look up in the sky about 70 degrees above the horizon. There's an object streaking out of the western desert sky relative to us about like this. I mean, it's really cooking. When it got right about here, it disappeared. I don't know whether Scotty beamed it up or what. Actually, what happened was, despite the fact that we were in total darkness, the space shuttle was so high up that the sun was still reflecting off of it. And when it got out of the range of the sun, we couldn't see it anymore. Now, when the space shuttle was in orbit, the space shuttle was traveling at about 18,000 miles an hour. That's 5 miles per second. You got trouble getting to work in the morning? Take the space shuttle. You'd be 5 miles a second. Think about how fast that is. Well, I did a little calculation to try and figure out how long would it take us if we could get in the space shuttle and go from our star, the sun, to another star in our galaxy, an average distance away 30 trillion miles. In other words, how long would it take us to go 30 trillion miles if we could go 5 miles per second? How long do you think it would take us? A long time. You must be a math major. Yeah. It would take us 201,450 years. That means if you got in the space shuttle at the time of Christ and started traveling from our star, the sun, to another star inside our galaxy, an average distance away, you've been going 5 miles a second for 2,000 years. You would be less than 1/100th of the way there right now. And we're going to explore space. No, we're not. We're not going anywhere in space. We can hardly get out of our solar system. It took us 9 years to get to Pluto. Do you realize that if our solar system is the size of a quarter, with the sun in the middle and Pluto on the outer rim, you know where the next nearest star is? It's over 2 football fields away. We're not going anywhere in space. Even at light speed, 186,000 miles per second, it would take you almost 4 years to get to another planet, or another star. Let's imagine we figure that. It's really too far and too dangerous. But let's suppose we figure out light speed. We get to another planetary system. Actually, what I'm about to show you is a little bit disturbing, but I'm going to show it to you anyway. We're going to need some more sound on this one, Manny. Let's suppose we get to another planetary system, we plant our flag, and then this happens. I see you're a sophisticated audience. To show you how analytical my wife is, I showed her that little video, and she smiled just a little bit, and then she said, "That's illogical. There's no sound in space." Now look what the psalmist says about God's love. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As high as the heavens are above the earth. How high are the heavens above the earth? If we've got 30 trillion miles just between stars in our galaxy, and there are other galaxies out there, what does this all mean? Well, the Hubble Space Telescope helps us discover what else is out there and how big this universe is. 20 years ago, they trained the Hubble Space Telescope on 1/26 millionth of the sky. What's 1/26 millionth of the sky? Go outside tonight, put a piece of rice on the end of your finger, hold it up. That piece of rice represents about 1/26 millionth of the sky. So they trained Hubble on that, and I'm going to show you what they found. This is called Hubble Ultra Deep Field. You can Google this. This video I'm about to show you is in the public domain. I don't know if you can see the bottom here. These are mountains down here. This is the southern hemisphere. I'm going to show you what Hubble found. It's a very short video. There is no audio. It's just video. When I play it, you're going to see the constellations come up, and then Hubble's going to zoom out to this one little speck of sky. You guys ready? Here we go. Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Let's see what they found. What you're looking at are nearly 10,000 galaxies in 1/26 millionth of the sky. Each of these galaxies supposedly has billions of stars of their own. How many stars are there in the entire universe? The number of stars in the entire universe are about equivalent to the number of grains of sand on all the beaches on all the earth times 100,000. And to go just between two of those stars in our galaxy going 5 miles a second will take you over 200,000 years. Now you know what the Bible means when it says the heavens declare the glory of God. Ladies and gentlemen, I never want to hear anybody here at Calvary Chapel, Tucson ever use the word awesome again unless you're talking about the heavens or God. Awesome shot, dude. Awesome shirt, dude. Awesome TikTok video, dude. No! What are you going to say for God? There's a problem, though. If this visual representation of the heavens are supposed to communicate God's immaterial qualities, and they are, we're all in a lot of trouble. Because this means that God's attributes are infinite, including his justice. And if his justice is infinite, none of us are going to make it. Look, there's only two things you can get at judgment. You can either get justice or you can get grace. I don't want justice. Do you want justice? Think about all the unjust things you've done in your life. All the unjust things you may have done today. I don't want justice. I want grace. So what's God's solution? I only read half the verse a few minutes ago. Here's the rest of it. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us. How has he removed our transgressions from us? If he's infinitely just. He added humanity to his deity. He came into this space-time continuum to allow the creatures that rebelled against him to torture and kill him so he could take their punishment, our punishment, upon himself. That way, he could remain just by punishing sin, but also, because he's infinitely loving, not punish us. Instead of punishing us, he punishes himself, he forgives us, and then he gives us his righteousness. This is why Jesus is the only way, ladies and gentlemen. It's not some arbitrary claim. There's just no other way an infinitely just being can allow unjust creatures like me and you to go unpunished. So he punishes himself in our place. That's why Paul says in Romans 3:26, God remains just and is the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Now, when you think that this universe has stars equivalent to sand grains on 100,000 Earths, and it's going to take you over 200,000 years just to go between those stars in our galaxy going 5 miles a second, does that make you feel insignificant? It shouldn't. Why? Because as amazing as the heavens are, they're not made in the image of God, but you are. In fact, the heavens were made for you. And here's the second part of the teleological argument, the design argument. Not only are the heavens designed, but your design. In fact, this is you in the womb at 11 weeks. Question, is this animal, mineral, vegetable, or human? Human. In fact, let's go back even further than 11 weeks. Let's go all the way back to when your mother and your father got together to conceive you. Have you guys had this talk before? I see some young people in here, so I'll try and be discreet. I also see some older people in here, so I'll try and be discreet as well, just in case if you've forgotten how this works. When your mother and father got together to conceive you, your mother unconsciously perfumed her egg to attract your father, and then your father sent the entire population of the United States, 300 million soldiers, toward your mother's egg. And then there was a race, and you won. Don't let anyone ever tell you you're not special. You beat out 300 million others. You have blown away anything Michael Phelps has done. Now, seeing some of you limping here earlier makes it hard for me to believe you were the fastest soldier in the gene pool, but you were. Now, your soldier was 20 to 30 times smaller than a grain of salt, yet it contained half of the 3.5 billion letter genome, that's your DNA, all the letters in the right order. That software program was written in that minuscule little soldier. And your mother's egg was about the size of a period at the end of a sentence, and it contained the other half of the 3.5 billion letter software program, your genome, all the letters in the right order. And when your soldier and your egg came together, a new 100% genetic human being was created. You know, you have not received any more genetic information from this point till right now. Your genetic information has just duplicated itself. In fact, there were only 4 things separating you from adulthood: time, air, water, and food. Those are the same 4 things that separate a 2-year-old from adulthood. A 2-year-old. We don't kill the 2-year-old. Why do we kill the unborn child in the womb? Genetically, it's the same. You say, oh, Frank, you can't legislate morality. All right. No extra charge for this. This was the subject of our first book, creatively titled Legislating Morality. All laws legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. You can't think of a law that doesn't legislate morality. The only question is, whose morality will we legislate? And when people say, don't impose your morality on me, I say, why not? Would that be immoral? And by the way, if we're not to impose morality, why are you imposing your morality on me? Why are you saying I ought not impose ought nots? Why do you get to impose ought nots, but I don't? Actually, the better answer is this. When someone says, don't impose your morality on me, you ought to say, this isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that theft is wrong, that mutilating children in a vain attempt to try and change their sex, which is impossible. I didn't make it up that that's not right. I didn't make up the fact that men were made for women and women were made for men, and the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one the Apostle Paul said, the Gentiles are not of the law written on their hearts. Look, if you have a problem with the morality, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the Creator upon whose nature this morality is derived. All right, no extra charge for that. Let's go back to this. From this point till right now, a construction project of astonishing complexity began taking place inside of you. Cells began multiplying at a rate of 4,000 cells per second. Brain cells began multiplying at a rate of 100,000 cells per second. For most of you anyway. Some cells became brain cells, others lung cells, others heart cells. Some cells went so far across you to become what they needed to become that it would be equivalent to you today walking across the United States alone. How did they know how to do this? Nobody knows. It's amazing. In fact, that construction project continues to this very moment. You just made 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another 4 million new red blood cells. You just made another, knock it off. I mean, are you thinking about this? Are you sitting there going, hold on, Frank, I got to concentrate, new red blood cells coming up? No, this is just happening. How is it happening? Aristotle noticed something 2,400 years ago. Of course, he didn't know anything about blood cells, but he did notice that all of nature's going in a direction. For example, why does an acorn, if it's properly nourished, always go in the direction of becoming an oak tree? Why doesn't it become an elm tree? Or a birch tree, or a seahorse? You say, well, it's programmed to become an oak tree. Well, who programmed it? And by the way, is an acorn conscious? Is an acorn in the ground thinking, all right, what do I have to do to become an oak tree? No. But it reliably goes in a direction of becoming an oak tree. If it doesn't have a mind of its own, and it doesn't, yet it reliably goes in a direction, there must be an external mind directing it toward an end. That's what Aristotle called the unmoved mover. Thomas Aquinas came along in the 1200s AD and he said, this is going to be my fifth way to argue for God. That all of nature's going in a direction, so there must be some being, some mind directing it. Now, you might hear atheists try and say, oh, Aristotle and Aquinas have been answered. No, they haven't. This is not, atheists think that they're talking about like a cause at the beginning, like a Big Bang cause. That's not their argument. In fact, Aristotle mistakenly thought the universe was eternal. He's saying even if the universe is eternal, there has to be a mind directing it right now. This is a right now cause, not a historical cause. It's a right now cause. In fact, God is to the universe what a band is to music. If a band were up here playing music, the band would be creating and sustaining the music. What would happen to the music the second the band stops playing? Music's over. Same thing is true with God. God creates the universe, the natural laws that govern it, and he creates you, and he sustains the universe and the natural laws that govern it, and he sustains you. If he were to pull his hand away, the universe and you would go out of existence. This is, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, why we can do science. You always hear atheists saying, oh, you don't need God because you got science. Science would be impossible without God. Because if the universe wasn't orderly and directed and continued to do the same thing over and over again, you couldn't do science. I mean, if cause and effect wasn't in place, or if natural laws changed every 10 minutes, you couldn't do any of this. So this is actually evidence for a being like God. Now, there's a lot more in a book we don't have here. It's called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case, if you want to go further in that. But we got to move now to our third argument for the existence of God, the moral argument. And probably the easiest way to communicate this argument is to talk football. How do you know that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing a pick six. That's when he throws it to the other team and they take it back for a touchdown. How do you know that? Men, where are you? Come on, we're talking football in church. Let's go. Huh? Not just the rules. You need more than rules. The referee. You need to know the purpose of the game. If you don't know the purpose of the game, you can't say that this play gets us closer to the purpose, the touchdown, and this play takes us further away from the purpose, the pick six. If there's no purpose, you can't say this is a good play and this is a bad play. There's got to be a purpose. Otherwise, the plays are just different, but you can't tell whether they're good or bad. Now notice, in football, the purpose of the game comes from outside the game. I think the Chiefs are playing right now, right? So they're out there playing right now. But when they got to the stadium, they didn't determine what the purpose of the game was. That came from outside the game. They didn't determine the rules either. Who set the rules? Well, the commissioner and the competition committee and the owners, they may tweak the rules every year a little bit. Why? Because the game of football is arbitrary. The rules could be different, right? But the game of life isn't arbitrary. The purpose and the rules come from outside the game, but they're based on the nature of God. If there is no God, you can't say this is good and this is bad, because if there is no purpose, there's really no moral difference at the end of the day whether you murder somebody or love them. It would just be your opinion. In fact, if there is no God, the Nazis were not wrong. It's just your opinion. If there is no God, love is no better than rape. Oh, you might like love better, but that's just a preference. If there is no God, there are no human rights. Have you noticed that we in America appear to be creating rights every 10 minutes? Yet a lot of the people who are saying they have a right to something are atheists. There's no right to anything if there's no God. There's not only no right to abortion, there's no right to life if there is no God. There's not only no right to same-sex marriage, there's no right to natural marriage if there is no God. There are no rights for anybody, for anything. It's just your opinion. And this is why our founding document states this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created and endowed by their government. No, it doesn't say that. Endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If there is no God, no creator, there are no rights. Governments can only put preferences into place. But there's got to be an objective standard outside of us in order for rights to exist. If there is no God, murder, slavery, and racism are not wrong. But we know they are. So there must be a standard of rightness that we're obligated to obey outside of ourselves. If there is no God, religious people have never done anything wrong. In fact, if you're a Christian, many of you in here are, what's the biggest objection you get from non-Christians about you? You're a hypocrite! You know, when people say you're a hypocrite, you know what you ought to do? You ought to say, I am. So, what does that prove? What does it prove? You know what it actually proves? A number of things. It actually is an argument for the existence of God. Why is hypocrisy wrong if there is no God? It's not. In fact, if there is no God, nothing's right or wrong. Now, I know a lot of people have been hurt by other Christians, and that's a tragedy, but you might expect people to be hurt by other Christians. Why? Because we're still fallen. We still need a Savior. If we were perfect, would we need a Savior? Now, if you know somebody who's been hurt by the church, maybe it's you. or somebody who's staying away from Christianity because Christians have been jerks. Dr. John Dixon, who teaches at Wheaton College, says you ought to consider this question. Here's the question. When somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame? Who do you blame? You don't blame Beethoven, right? You blame the player. So when somebody plays Jesus poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Jesus. Look, just because I'm not true and beautiful doesn't mean Jesus isn't true and beautiful. In fact, if I was true and beautiful all the time, I wouldn't need Jesus. If I was perfect, maybe I haven't said this yet. Do you realize that you can get to heaven by being good? Yeah, you can. You just got to be perfect your whole life. Too late for me. How about you? No, we need a Savior. Many years ago, I had a couple of debates with Christopher Hitchens. You guys know who Christopher Hitchens was? He was a brilliant British atheist who sounded more brilliant than he was because he had a British accent. And he wrote the book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. We'll see here in a minute that he has no standard by which to say anything's good or evil, which is what he's trying to say here, if he's an atheist. But I said to him during the debate, I said, Christopher, a lot of what you write in your book is true. Religious people have done evil things, but number one, nothing would be evil unless there was something good, and nothing would be good unless God existed. But number two, you're kind of proving our worldview, that we're fallen and we need a Savior. In fact, I said, Christopher, I'm a hypocrite. I can't live up to what Jesus told me to live up to. But if I could, I wouldn't need him. So when people say I can't go to church because there's too many hypocrites down there, I always say, come on down, pal. We got room for one more. The church is a hospital for sinners. It's not a country club for saints. Of course we're fallen. To say I can't go to church because there's too many hypocrites down there would be like saying I can't go to the gym because there's too many people out of shape down there. Well, that's why they're there. They're trying to get into shape. That's the whole point. And by the way, religion doesn't poison everything. Everything poisons religion. I poison religion because I don't live up to the pure words of Christ. But again, if I could, I wouldn't need him. So always ask the question, when somebody plays Beethoven poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Beethoven. If there is no God, tolerance is no better than intolerance. Now, ladies and gentlemen, are Christians commanded to be tolerant? Be careful how you answer. Are we? No. Why? Christians are commanded to love. You see, tolerance is too weak. Tolerance says, hold your nose and put up with them. Love says, reach out and help them. And we're not supposed to tolerate evil. If we were supposed to tolerate evil, then we wouldn't really be loving people. And too many people in our culture thinks love means approval. Well, if you love me, you'll approve of what I do. Every parent knows that's nonsense. By the way, how many parents do we have in here? All right, how many former children do we have in here? Okay, good. That's all of us then. Question. If your parents approved of everything you wanted to do when you were 13, would they have been loving parents? Would they have been loving parents? No, you can't approve of everything a 13-year-old wants to do. You need to stand in the way of evil. You'd be enabling evil if you don't stand in the way of it. So love does not mean approval. In fact, in the passage that everybody reads at their wedding, but nobody obeys, 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, love always protects. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing. Love rejoices in the truth. Love always perseveres. Jesus gave us one new command. You know what the one new command was? Love one another as I have loved you. How did he love us? He sacrificed himself for us. You know what we tend to do? We tend to sacrifice other people for ourselves. When we tell people what they want to hear, we're actually sacrificing them for ourselves. Because we don't want to take the blowback, right? So we just agree, oh yeah, whatever you want to do is fine with me. Oh, I'm with you. We're enabling them. In fact, Thomas Sowell, who says everything well, put it this way. When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. How many people you've been telling what they want to hear, particularly on the sexual issues? Oh yeah, whatever you're doing is fine, it's good, it's right. No, it's not. You know it's not. And you're too wimpy to love them enough to stand in the way of it. You'll sacrifice yourself if you love somebody. You'll say, you're going to hate me for this, but that's what love requires. For me to love you enough to say, I can't support what you're doing. In fact, you might want to ask somebody you have in your life like that this question. Hey, if I was about to go down a road that would be harmful to me and others, would you love me enough to tell me? Oh, of course I would. Can I do that for you right now? And by the way, if there is no God, you can't complain about the problem of evil. Why? Because evil doesn't exist unless there's a standard. And that standard can only exist if God exists. C.S. Lewis recognized this. You know, early on in his life, he was in World War I, and he said, there can't be a good God. There's too much evil in the world. There's too much injustice in the world. Then one day he had an epiphany. It dawned on him that his argument didn't work, and he put it in the book Mere Christianity. How many have read Mere Christianity? Okay, if you haven't read Mere Christianity, consider yourself undereducated. Go read it. Go get it tonight and read it. Anyway, here's what he says in Mere Christianity. As an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how would I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, you wouldn't know what a crooked line was unless you knew what a straight line was. You wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. Something can't be immoral unless something is moral. There's got to be a standard. That standard is God's nature. You say, well, wait, why can't evil exist on its own? Because evil is not a thing in itself. It's a lack in a good thing. Evil is like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a good body, you got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? You got nothing. Evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. What happens if you take all the car out of the rust? You got a Pinto. Okay? Right? It doesn't exist on its own. Or you could put it this way. The shadows prove the sunshine. In order to have shadows, you got to have sunshine. In other words, in order to have evil, you have to have good. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil. But you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can't have evil without good. So I know this is going to sound counterintuitive, but if evil exists, God exists. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. Now, you can ask the question, why does God allow certain evils? We'll deal with that during the Q&A if you want. But you can't say it disproves God, because there'd be no such thing as evil unless there was good, and there'd be no such thing as good unless God existed. You guys with me on this? All right, so let's sum up these three arguments. There's much more in the books on them. Cosmological argument. From that argument, we get that the cause is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, and intelligent. From the teleological argument, we get more information that this being is intelligent, and this being also sustains the universe and directs it. And the moral argument shows that this being is also morally perfect. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, moral cause that created all things and sustains all things, who do you think of? God. Now, notice, these are the attributes of the God of the Bible, and we haven't even opened the Bible yet. This is called natural theology. You don't need the Bible to know the attributes of God. There are a few attributes you need from Revelation, special revelation in the Bible, like the Trinity and that Jesus is God. But you know there's a creator and a sustainer out there without any reference to any religious writing. In fact, if someone were to ever ask you, how do you know that God exists? Here's what I think you ought to say. I know God by his effects. You're reasoning from effect back to cause. If there's a creation, that's the effect. You're reasoning back to a cause, a creator. If there's design, that's the effect. You're reasoning back to a cause, a designer. If there's a moral law written on your heart, that's the effect. You're reasoning back to a moral law giver. If there's evidence of man predicted and accomplished his own resurrection from the dead. That's the effect. You're reasoning back to a cause. Who could do that? Only a being like God. You're reasoning from effect back to cause. Even if you think you've had some sort of personal experience with God, you're doing the same thing. The personal experience is the effect, and you're reasoning back to the cause. The cause must be God. So you're reasoning from effect to cause. That's what scientists do. What do scientists do? They're trying to figure out what particular cause caused a particular effect. And what is the queen of all sciences? It's not physics. It's theology. Because theology takes into account every academic discipline and sees how it fits under one big rubric of truth. Now, you're probably thinking, Frank, don't atheists have good arguments against this? No, they don't. In fact, we deal with some of their arguments in the book, but C.S. Lewis dealt with it in about a paragraph. Because most atheists today are materialists. You know what materialism means? That you're just a molecular machine. You think you have a mind, but you don't. You just have a brain. You think you have a soul, you don't. You just have a body. Every thought you have is the result of the laws of physics. You don't have free will. You're a moist robot, according to the atheist today. Here's what C.S. Lewis said about this. Check this out. I can't say it any better. And this is a 2-slide quote. Check this out. Here's what he says. Suppose there were no intelligence behind the universe. In that case, nobody designed my brain for the purpose of thinking. Thought is merely the byproduct of some atoms within my skull. But if so, how can I trust my own thinking to be true? But if I can't trust my own thinking, of course I can't trust the arguments leading to atheism, and therefore have no reason to be an atheist or anything else. Unless I believe in God, I can't believe in thought, so I can never use thought to disbelieve in God. Boom, as John Madden would say. You can't say it any better than that. Materialism makes reason itself impossible, and yet they think they have reasons to disbelieve in God. Now, if we have this spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal, intelligent, moral, sustaining creator, how do we know it's the God of the Bible? For that, we got to move on to the next question. Are miracles possible? Now, you're probably looking at your watch going, how's he going to finish all this? Actually, number 3 is really quick. It's not hard to show miracles are possible. All right? And God can use miracles to confirm a message from God. In fact, why do people follow Moses? Because Moses can do miracles. Why do people follow Jesus and the apostles? Because they can do miracles. Miracles are God's way of getting our attention to say, listen to these people. Here's the problem. Some people believe miracles are impossible. Like, for example, Noah and the ark. Christians, can we all agree on one thing in here between us? Noah and the ark is crazy. Can we admit that? I asked earlier, has anyone seen a resurrection? The answer is no. How can you believe in a resurrection? Never see him. And for some reason, the big problem miracle in the Bible is Jonah. Is that a tail of a whale or a whale of a tail? Can you really believe in Jonah? Well, ladies and gentlemen, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? Yeah, the greatest miracle in the Bible is not the resurrection, Jonah or Noah. The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If that verse is true, every other verse in the Bible is at least possible. And here's the interesting thing. Even the atheists are admitting the evidence for the first verse. They don't think it's God, but what else could it be? We've already been through this. So if Genesis 1:1 is true, is it possible that the resurrection's true? Is it possible that Noah and Jonah are true? Of course, if God can create the universe out of nothing, then he can do whatever he wants that's not logically impossible inside the universe. Actually, Noah's pretty plausible. I was just at the Ark encounter like a month ago. You guys ever been there? It's in Kentucky. Man, it's quite impressive. And of course, if God wants to work miracles, he can do that. So miracles certainly are possible if the first verse of the Bible is true. That's the greatest miracle of all time. And the evidence shows that the first verse of the Bible is true. So maybe these other miracles are possible. Now, I know some people are saying, well, I can't believe in a miracle because I've never seen one. Now, that's not necessarily a good reason to disbelieve something. Why? Because you believe in a lot of things you've never seen. You believe in your mind. Have you ever seen it? You're using it right now. You believe in the laws of logic and the laws of math. Have you ever seen those? No, you're using them right now. You believe in justice. Have you ever seen justice? Oh, you may have seen people treated justly or unjustly, but you've never seen justice in itself. It's an immaterial reality grounded in the nature of God. You've never seen love. Everybody believes in love. Oh, you may have been loved. You may have loved other people. You've never seen it in itself. In fact, in the second debate we had with Christopher Hitchens at the College of New Jersey, some student in the audience asked Christopher Hitchens this question: Christopher, what is love? And Hitchens, being a materialist, being a moist robot, had to come up with a materialistic answer. You know what he said? He said, love is a chemical. And I said, don't tell that to your wife. Honey, do you love me? Yeah, why? Because I got the chemical today. You know, tomorrow I might not have it, but right now I got it. No, love is not a chemical. It again is a virtue grounded in the nature of God to seek what's best for the loved one. You've never seen gravity. Oh, Frank, there it is right there. No, you're not seeing gravity. What are you seeing? You're seeing the effects of gravity. We don't even know what gravity is. You know that? You've never seen George Washington. Yet you believe he existed. Why? Because he's left effects behind that are best explained by a man who lived from 1732 to 1799. Even though you've never seen him, you believe in him. You've never seen Jesus in the flesh. Yet you believe in him. Why? Because he's left effects behind. And you're reasoning back to a cause. Now, you need to realize that even if there have been no miracles since the first century, Christianity is still true. Now, I think there have been miracles since the first century, but you don't need them to show that Christianity is true. In fact, even if miracles occur today, they ought to be rare. Why? Because if they happened all the time, we wouldn't think they're miracles. We'd say this stuff happens all the time. I mean, imagine if people rose from the dead routinely. What would the resurrection of Christ mean? Nothing. You go to somebody and you go, hey, Jesus rose from the dead to prove he was God. And the guy goes, so what? Uncle Leroy just rose from the dead 2 weeks ago. Now I got to give the inheritance back. No, it's got to be a rare event. It can't be a regular event. If people were popping up from the dead all the time, the resurrection of Christ would mean nothing. In fact, there are things that happen every day that are so spectacular, but we don't call them miracles because they do happen every day. How many people in here, every mother should raise your hand, it's only the guys I'm after. How many people in here have seen your own flesh and blood born? Now, when you see that, you don't go, evolution, right? You go, this is amazing. How does this happen? We made whoopee 9 months ago, and now look at this. How does this happen? We don't call it a miracle because it happens every day, but there's design behind it. So, miracles certainly are possible if Genesis 1:1 is true. And the evidence shows it is true. So the next question we have, is it true that one event in the ancient world took place, and that is the resurrection of Jesus? Now, in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we have a chapter called The Top 10 Reasons We Know the New Testament Writers Told the Truth. We don't have time for 10. We're only going to look at 2 briefly, okay? The first one I want to look at is something called embarrassing stories. And this is going to show, in my mind anyway, they're not making this up. What do I mean by embarrassing stories? Historians know that if there's something embarrassing to the author or authors in the text, it's probably true. Why? Why would it be true? Because you're not going to invent stories that embarrass you, right? You're not going to invent things that make you look bad. You might invent things that make you look good, but you won't invent things that make you look bad. fact, let me ask you guys a question. How many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look good? If you don't have your hand up right now, you're lying to make yourself look good. And it's not working. We know you're lying. All right, how many people in here have ever lied to make yourself look bad? No, you don't do that. You might lie to make yourself look good, but you won't lie to embarrass yourself. Well, the New Testament writers, this is true of the Old Testament as well, but we're just looking at the New Testament. The New Testament writers have filled the New Testament with embarrassing stories they never would have invented. That's why we're calling this the duh factor. They're not making this up. Let me just give you a few of them. Peter, the leader of the apostles, is called Satan by Jesus. Do you think they invented this? Do you think Mark, who wrote this down, said, hey, Pete, I'm going to make this a real interesting story. I'm going to have the Lord call you Satan. What do you think Peter would have said? Have him call you Satan. Look, I'm the leader here. This is embarrassing, right? No, he's not going to do that. And then Peter says, Lord, I'll never deny you. What does he wind up doing? He denies him 3 times. And then at the crucifixion, all the disciples, maybe with the exception of one, they all run away. They're cowards. This is like a Monty Python movie. Run away! They all run away. And who are the brave ones? Ladies, who are the brave ones? The women. The women are the brave ones. Now, that's right. Give yourselves a hand, right? I am woman, hear me roar. Now, who wrote the New Testament documents down? Men. Now, what man is going to invent that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb? Would any man in here invent that? I mean, if I was there and inventing it, I'd make myself look good, wouldn't you? I mean, I'd write down, let's see, we marched right down there and we overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds good. What do you think? John said, get out. Peter roundhouse kicked him. Thomas said, we'll be back. No doubt. Some of you will get that tomorrow. And then on Sunday morning, we marched right down to the tomb, and we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. I would never say it was Mr. Sissy Pants while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. Oh, by the way, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses? I mean, forget the fact it was embarrassing to men. It was. But independent of that, why would you never say the women were the first witnesses? Because in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you're trying to get people to believe your story, you'd only have the men be the first witnesses. Yet all 4 Gospels say the women are the first witnesses, which is telling us what? They really were. As embarrassing as it was. Actually, and by the way, one of the women first witnesses was a formerly demon-possessed woman. Gee, what a credible witness she must be, huh? No, they're not making this up. I actually had a woman come up to me once. She said, Frank, I know why Jesus appeared to the women first. I said, why? And she said, because he wanted to get the story out. I said, that is an excellent point. Because ladies, when your man comes home from work, does he say much? It could have been a nuclear explosion down at the plant. He's not going to tell you. You'll see it on the news before you hear it from him. You'll be watching the news going, hey, hon, what happened? Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you. The nuke blew up. I've been hot for 3 days. What's for dinner? He's not going to tell you. I can't even believe this next verse is in the New Testament, but it is. Do you know when Jesus takes his disciples at the end of the Gospel of Matthew into Galilee up on the mountain and he gives them the Great Commission? I mean, this is the climax of the Gospel of Matthew. Go therefore, make disciples of all nations. Notice he doesn't say make believers. He says make disciples. There's a difference, right? Anyway, as he's giving them the Great Commission, it says right there in verse 17 about the disciples, some believed, but some doubted. What? He's standing resurrected right in front of them. And they're going, you see that guy over there? Yep. That guy over there is Jesus. Oh, no, it can't be Jesus. He was just killed not long ago. No, I'm telling you, it's him. Look, the Romans killed him. Jesus is dead. It's him. You know what they did to him? They whipped him. They put nails in him. They put a spear in his side. Blood and water came out. I'm telling you, Jesus is dead. It's him. It can't be. It is. How do you know? The women told me. They're not making this up. There's even potentially embarrassing details about Jesus in there. Jesus is considered out of his mind by his own family who want to seize him and take him away. This is Mark chapter 3. His own family thinks he's nuts. His brothers don't believe in him. That's embarrassing. We learn later, however, that Jesus' half-brother James dies as a martyr 30 years after the alleged resurrection. And it's not even the New Testament that tells us this. Josephus, the Jewish historian, says James is thrown off the Temple Mount by the Sanhedrin, and then they stone him to death. He's the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. When 30 years earlier, he didn't think his own brother was God. Why is he dying as a martyr 30 years later in the very city that Jesus is alleged to have risen from the dead in? The earliest evidence for the resurrection is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8. That's an ancient creed that they actually passed along verbally before Paul wrote it down in 1 Corinthians in about 55 AD. You know what 1 Corinthians 15, 3 to 8 says? It says everybody who Jesus appeared to. You know who he appeared to? One of the people he appeared to? James. That must have convinced him. Before Jesus resurrected, James said, yo, bro, you ain't God. After he rose from the dead, he said, yo, bro, you're God. Now, how many people in here have a brother? All right, how many people have a brother who thinks he's God? Yeah, you don't believe in him either, right? Neither did James until the resurrection. Jesus is called a madman. He's called a drunkard. He's called demon-possessed. You think they invented this? No, they're just telling the truth. Then he has his feet wiped with the hair of a prostitute, which easily could have been seen as a sexual advance. And oh, by the way, notice there are two prostitutes in Jesus' bloodline. Who are they? Rahab and Tamar. Now, do you think Matthew, who wrote down the genealogy, thought to himself, you know what, I really think I need to spice up the Messiah's bloodline a little bit. Let me put a couple of prostitutes in there. No. In fact, there's a lot of shady people in the Messiah's bloodline. Judah, from where we get the term Jew from, Jesus from the tribe of Judah. You know who Judah was? Not a good guy. He's the guy that sold his brother Joseph into slavery. He's the guy that slept with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. And he's in the bloodline of the Messiah. Then you got David. David, a man after God's own heart. Yeah, but he's a liar, adulterer, and a murderer. Gee, I guess there's hope for the rest of us then, huh? You got Bathsheba in there. In fact, when Matthew gets to her in the genealogy, he doesn't mention her name. What does he say instead? Uriah's wife. He's telling the truth, but it's a slam. Who's Uriah? The husband of Bathsheba, whom David had killed so he could have Bathsheba. This is embarrassing, but they're telling the truth. And then Jesus is hung on a tree. Despite the fact, according to Deuteronomy 21:23, anyone who's hung on a tree is under God's curse. Hey, if you're making up a Messiah to the Jews, you don't hang him on a tree. But Jesus was under God's curse. What? The curse of sin we put him under. In fact, think about this, ladies and gentlemen. What are the two trees you find in Genesis? The tree of life and tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Go all the way to the end of the book, the Bible, all the way to Revelation. What's the one tree remaining? Tree of life. Do you know there's a tree in the middle? The tree in the middle is the tree they hung Jesus on. Because we sinned at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we're never going to have access to the tree of life unless he takes our punishment on himself. But if you were making this up, you would never do it this way, especially for the Jews. Now, there's a lot more in the book on that, but we don't have time to get into it. We got to move on to the next piece of evidence they're telling the truth, and that is excruciating deaths. This is the argument that says that these men who were in a position to know whether Jesus had resurrected from the dead were Jews, and they knew They could verify with their own senses that Jesus had resurrected from the dead or not. They already thought they were God's chosen people. Why would they invent a resurrected Jesus when there are two things they didn't believe could happen? That a man could claim to be God, that would be blasphemy, and they didn't think that someone would rise from the dead in the middle of time. They knew people would rise from dead at the end of time, but they didn't think one guy would do it in the middle of time. In fact, it's critically important to understand this. All the people of the New Testament who wrote the New Testament, all of them are Jews except Luke. Everyone else is a Jew. Why are they inventing this? In fact, think about this. Look at the apostles' beliefs and practices before and after the resurrection. Before the resurrection, they believed in animal sacrifice. They've been slaying lambs to Yahweh for hundreds of years. Suddenly, Jesus comes along and they say, we don't need to slay these lambs anymore because these lambs are symbols of the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Here he is, right here. They get rid of the sacrificial system virtually overnight. Before, they believed in a binding law of Moses. Afterwards, Christ's life fulfills the binding law of Moses. Before, they believed in strict monotheism. Afterwards, they're believing in a Trinity. 3 persons in one divine essence. Yes, you can get the Trinity from the Old Testament, but it's much clearer in the New. Before, they believed in the Sabbath. In fact, they thought they could be stoned for not obeying the Sabbath. Afterwards, they're worshiping on Sunday. And Paul says, don't let anyone tell you have to obey any Sabbath or festival day. In fact, out of the 10 commandments, 9 of them are repeated in the New Testament. What's the only one not? Keep holy the Sabbath. Why? Because the Sabbath has arrived. Who's the Sabbath? Jesus is the Sabbath. He is our rest. We rest in him. Before, they believed in a conquering Messiah, afterwards a sacrificial Messiah. Before, they believed in circumcision, afterwards they believed in baptism and communion. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what would cause these pious Jews who thought they were God's chosen people to abandon everything on the left and then adopt everything on the right virtually overnight at the expense of torture and death? The only thing I can think of is what psychologists call an impact event. What's an impact event? An impact event is an event that is so impactful that it can change your life 180 degrees. Some impact events are so dramatic, although you might not remember what you had for breakfast this morning, you'll remember an impact event that happened 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago if you're old enough. In fact, there's only a few of you in this room that can answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you can remember where you were and what you were doing November 22nd, 1963, hold your hand up and hold it up high. All right, ladies and gentlemen, you see these people with their hands up? These people are very old. November 22nd, 1963 is my earliest memory. I was 2 years old in 2 days. Yes, I'm 62 years old now. I know. I don't look a day over 61. In fact, when I turned 50, my wife was very encouraging. She said, honey, you're going to live to be 100. I said, how do you know? She said, because you look half dead already. Anyway, I'm 2 years old in 2 days. I'm standing in the living room in our home in Wanamassett, New Jersey. I'm a toddler, and my mom is sitting on an ottoman in front of a black and white TV, weeping uncontrollably. Mommy, what's the matter? They killed the president. President Kennedy assassinated that day. That's my earliest memory. I'd never seen my mom cried like that. "2 years old and 2 days. I don't remember anything before that, and very little after that. In fact, I can see my mom in my mind right now when she was 26 years old, sitting on that ottoman. She's 85 right now, but I can see her in my mind when she was 26. Where were you when the second plane hit the tower? I was in my office at my home. I had the TV on behind me. I'd seen the first tower had been hit. I didn't know by what. And I was on the phone to a pastor on the north side of Charlotte, and we were talking about what I would speak about when I came to his church. And I said, you got the TV on? He goes, yeah. I go, maybe a Cessna hit the World Trade Tower, because that had happened before. And as we're talking, he yells into the phone, The second tower just got hit. I turned around, look at the TV, the second tower's on fire. I said, was it a Cessna? He goes, no, it was like a United plane. It was a big plane. It was a passenger plane. I said, you saw that? He said, it just happened on live TV. I said, look, let me call you back. I hung up the phone. For some reason that morning I had CNN on, the communist news network. And I'm not making this up, but the commentator on CNN literally said, one has to think there's some sort of navigational error here. I said, navigational error, you dimwit. This is the clearest day in the history of the Big Apple. What do you think, the pilots can't see where they're going? You think Stevie Wonder's flying these planes? I mean, come on, this is terrorism. I called that pastor the next day. I said, we're going to come to your church and talk about Islam because that's what this is related to. Now, 9/11 was over 22 years ago. But those who are old enough can remember something about that day. But if I were to ask you where you were 22 days ago, most of you are going to go, let me look at my iPhone. What was I doing that day? I don't know. Why can you remember something from 22 years ago but not 22 days ago? No impact event 22 days ago. Impact event 22 years ago. Do you think a resurrection would have been an impact event? Do you think if he really came out of that tomb and then did miracles and stayed with them for 40 days, they would have remembered it? Of course. In fact, think about this. What did the New Testament writers have to gain by making up a new religion? What did they have to gain by saying this was true? Well, they got kicked out of the synagogue and then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks, right? And then you might ask, why would they do this? They had every motive to say the resurrection did not happen, not every motive to say it did. You know, I get this question sometimes. Are there any non-Christian writers that talk about Jesus and the apostles? Yeah, they are. They're all in chapter 9 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. But you know the illicit assumption that is sometimes under that question is this. You really can't trust the New Testament writers because, you see, they were biased. They were religious. You can only trust the non-Christian writers. If you think about that for more than 10 seconds, you realize how stupid that objection is. What did these people have to gain by saying it was true? Nothing. They had everything to lose. In fact, some of you may know my friend J. Warner Wallace. He's the cold case homicide detective that's been on Dateline more than any other homicide detective because he solves murders decades old. And he's a Christian as well and wrote the book Cold Case Christianity, where he takes his detective skills and applies it to the greatest homicide of all time, the homicide of Jesus. And Jim says whenever he finds a body that he knows has been murdered, he says there's only one or more of these three reasons why that guy's dead. I don't have to chase down 1,000 motivations. That guy was murdered for one of these three or more of these three reasons. There was either a sex issue, a money issue, or a power issue. Sex, money, or power. Those are the three things that can drive people to murder. In fact, those are the same three things that drive any of us to sin. Why? Because sex, money, and power are good things. In fact, they're so good, we'll often take shortcuts to get them. And so Jim says, if you're going to say the New Testament writers have invented all this, you got to find one or more of these three motivators as to why they would do it. So let's take a look, ladies and gentlemen. Did the New Testament writers get real popular with the ladies for saying Jesus had resurrected from the dead? No, they didn't get sex. Did they get money? No, they weren't 21st century prosperity gospel preachers. Did they get power? No, they got the opposite of power. They got persecuted. Paul had power when he was a persecutor of the church. As soon as he becomes a Christian, he's the one persecuted. They didn't get sex. They didn't get money. They didn't get power. There's no motivation to make this up. And every motivation to say it wasn't true, and they said it was true anyway. In fact, you might ask, why would they die for a known lie? You say, wait a minute, Frank. If you're going to say that martyrdom somehow shows Christianity is true, don't you have to say it shows Islam is true? No. Why? Because there's a lot of differences between the Muslim martyrs of today and the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times. Let me just give you one difference for our purposes here. The Muslim martyrs of today haven't witnessed anything that tells them that Islam is true. They just have faith. But the New Testament martyrs of New Testament times witnessed Jesus rise from the dead, or at least witnessed him risen. They saw Jesus. They touched Jesus. They ate with Jesus. They verified with their own senses that Jesus had risen from the dead. Some people will die for a lie they think is the truth. Nobody will die for a lie they know is a lie. And the New Testament writers were in a position to know whether it was a lie or not, and they went to their deaths anyway. You can't get better evidence than that unless you were there yourself. All right, last thing we're going to say on this is going to sound like heresy to some of you who believe the Bible's inerrant like I do. But it's not. Stick with me. Christianity is not true because a series of documents we put under one binding we call the Bible says it's true. In fact, Christianity would be true if the Bible never existed. You say, how can that be? Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize there were thousands of Christians before a line of the New Testament was ever written? Why? Because they didn't read about it in a book. Christianity did not start with a book. Christianity started with an event, the resurrection. There would be no book written by Jews in the first century claiming a man claimed to be God and rose from the dead, unless a man really did claim to be God and rose from the dead. In fact, we could put it this way. The New Testament writers did not create the resurrection. The resurrection created the New Testament writers. You wouldn't have these documents written by Jews in the first century if this was invented. There is too much to lose. So, thankfully, they did write it down so we could know about it and orient our lives according to it. But if they had never written it down, it still would have been true. Do you see the point? So, what's the overall argument? Does truth exist? If someone says there is no truth, you're going to say, is that true? Does God exist? First argument. This is known as review. We're doing review now. First argument. Cosmological argument. Second argument. Teleological argument. Third argument. Moral argument. From those three arguments, we get a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created and sustains all things. Are miracles possible? Greatest miracle in the Bible? Creation, Genesis 1:1. Even the atheists admit that the universe was created. If that verse is true, every other verse is at least possible. Did Jesus rise from the dead? We only looked at 2 out of 10 reasons as to why the New Testament writers are telling the truth. We looked at embarrassing stories and excruciating deaths. They're not making it up. Now, there's a lot more in the book. For those of you that weren't here this morning, and you want the entire PowerPoint presentation, even slides I couldn't show you, just put your iPhone or your Droid on that, and it'll take you to a website. And we will send you the entire PowerPoint presentation in a PDF format. We also have the books and the DVDs on the table back there. And Christmas is coming up, so give the gift of apologetics. Has anyone ever said that in the history of the world? Probably not. All right. So check that out. And also know that we're now teaching online courses. You can go to our website, crossexamine.org. In fact, the new Why I Still Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist online course starts in January, and we even have one for 6th to 8th graders. So go to crossexamine.org, and they can be a part of that. So, final thing, it's true, Christianity, so what? So what if it's true? Well, the best news of all, somebody actually did die for you. There's evidence for this. Now, when I was in the Navy, I was in naval aviation, so we had to earn golden wings, which were fairly hard to earn. But there's nothing more difficult in the Navy and maybe any military to earn than a golden trident. That's what the SEALs earn. Very few people that start SEAL training make it through, maybe 5%. Those that do make it through wear that trident with pride. It is their identity. When Michael Monsoor was buried in Rosecrans Cemetery in San Diego, California, just about every Navy SEAL on the West Coast showed up for his funeral. And when they passed his casket, they took off their tridents and pressed them into his casket. They took their identity and put their identity in the one that sacrificed for them, the one that died for them. That's what we're supposed to do. But our culture says, oh no, put your identity in your political party, or put your identity in your sexual orientation, or your gender identity, or your job, or your vocation, or your bank account, or even another person. Ladies and gentlemen, none of those things are ultimate. We were not meant to put our identity into any of those things. I mean, imagine you put your identity in, say, your sexual preference. What happens when you can no longer sexually perform? Or you're no longer sexually preferred? You don't have an identity? You put your identity in your job. What happens when you lose your job? You no longer have an identity. You put your identity in another person. What happens when, God forbid, that person dies or leaves you? You don't have an identity? No, your identity was meant to be put in your Savior. The one that not only died for you, but then rose again, showing you that you will one day rise again. This is why John, who wrote the biography we call the Gospel of John, in the very first chapter says, he has given you the right to become a child of God. How do you become a child of God? You accept the identity that he provides, an heir to the throne. You can't lose that. You can lose your health. You can lose your kids, tragically. You can lose your marriage. You can lose your job. You can lose your money. You can lose your abilities. Ultimately, you're going to lose your life. The only thing you can't lose is Jesus, the Savior. So quit fiddling around with all these short little term identities that just drive you crazy. In fact, you realize Christianity is the only worldview where you don't achieve your identity, you receive your identity. If you have to achieve your identity, all the pressure's on you, and there's always somebody that can do it better. But if you just receive your identity as a gift, it's eternal, it's freeing, you can't lose it, and it's what you were meant to do. So, if people here haven't done that, tonight is the night to do that. To accept what Christ has done, to repent of your sins and walk into the family of God with a new eternal identity. I mean, what could be better than that? Now, with that said, we're going to go to questions. And we've got a microphone set up over here so everyone can hear you. This is also being streamed. You got to come up here to the microphone. And nobody likes to ask the first question, so we're going to move right on to the second question. Second question right over here. After one person starts, then we can get going. Yes, sir. What's your name?
My name is David.
Say again?
David.
David, go ahead, sir.
Great. Well, I'll give a quick background. I run an outreach ministry. We do a lot of apologetics at the U of A. I lead a team of 6 people. I've even used some of your information because in years past, got to pull this up a little. In years past, I would always get the slavery question. And I was like, you know, your video on that was really helpful because...
On which question? Hey, is there a monitor up here, Manny? It's hard for me to hear the questions sometimes. No monitor up here? All right.
Okay,
get
so
real close. Go
I was
ahead.
just giving you a little bit of background. I read, last night you said something, and I read through I got your book, this Hollywood Heroes book, and I wanted to ask a question concerning that. I was just giving background to who I am. So you said last night that Harry Potter was the best archetype of Jesus Christ in Hollywood, and I'd have to beg to differ. I'm going to ask 2 quick questions, but the backdrop is creating correlation between...
Hang on for a second. What we said in the book was that arguably Harry Potter has more in common as a fictional character in modern fiction than any other. That's what we said.
Right.
Yeah.
So the danger that I saw in that is creating a correlation between the gospel and fiction can cause the unbeliever to say, see, we can make fiction today with the same higher moral principles as the gospels, and that we even run into that on campus at times. Because all the false religions of the world, you know, they have about 90% substance of truth, but it's the poison that's mixed in that is deadly. So this is the real question. In your book, I feel that you don't take into account that Satan can incorporate true principles and good principles into Hollywood to give people a temporary substitute that seduces their minds and feeds their need for greater purpose through fictional storylines. On top of that, there's all the warnings in the Bible about if anything is pertaining to witchcraft, it's spiritually deadly, that, Hollywood fills things with the occult, Harry Potter, filled with occult. So this is the question. Could the superhero stories of the 20th and 21st century just be a revamping of idolatry for the 21st century? And if so, which I'm convicted they are, shouldn't we see them as instruments to seduce the mind and pull it away from Jesus rather than tools to help people come to Christ?
Well, I'm sure that's possible. You could use anything for evil, right? You can. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is, what do you want to use it for? What we're saying is, given the ubiquitousness of these movies that all people seem to enjoy, and especially children, we think even if you don't see the movies, which is what we put in the book, that you ought to know something about the storyline. Because if your friend, say, loves Harry Potter, and you're, say, a 12-year-old, you could say to that kid, you like Harry Potter? Yeah, I love Harry Potter. Do you realize who the real Harry Potter is? Who Harry Potter was patterned after? It's patterned after Jesus.
But doesn't that create the seduction kind of the... Because I deal with that. Like on the university, people will say... we have a book of Spider-Man. 2,000 years from now, is somebody going to come up with a religion of Spider-Man?
Okay, let me ask you this, David. One of the arguments we make, and actually my friend J. Warner Wallace makes it in his book, Person of Interest. Mm-hmm. What he says is the most influential human being in the history of the world is Jesus of Nazareth, right?
Amen. Yeah.
It is unfathomable, even to secular scholars, to think Jesus never existed, and yet he is the centerpiece of the human race, right? I submit to anybody here, does anybody here think that 2,000 years from now, Luke Skywalker is going to be the center of human history if there is a universe 2,000 years from now?
No.
No.
Of course not. I don't believe that. I'm saying what atheists sometimes will use even in discussion with me. So the reason why I bring up that point is to say that doesn't trying to use Hollywood to point to Christ create a potential whirlpool that pulls people into
I would rather take the good that comes out of Hollywood and use it to point to the gospel than to say, avoid that stuff completely, and anybody that gets involved in it, I'm never going to talk to about this.
Right, and I agree, but
right. Let me finish.
Yeah,
it's
go ahead.
It's our contentment here, or our assertion here, our belief, my son and I, that so many people see these movies, and particularly with regard to Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling admits she got the story from the Bible, as you see in the first few pages of that chapter. She's getting the storyline from the Bible. So why not say, if you love these characters, you ought to look at who the character was modeled after, somebody who actually did exist and actually can save you. Harry Potter can't save you. He doesn't exist. Jesus can. So that's all we're using the books for.
Okay, last thought. The counterpoint that I believe kind of actually bypasses that point is that Satan creates many counterfeits and he incorporates many factors of truth. Religions have many factors of truth, and we would never, say, let me show you in the Quran why you should believe in Jesus, or to a Hindu, let me read.
Yeah, you ought to know what the Quran says.
Right, but I would never use that as a legitimator of why.
I would use it with a Muslim. You know what the Quran says about Jesus? That he was sinless.
Right.
That he was virgin born.
That's true.
That he's going to come back and judge. So I would use the Quran with a Muslim.
But it's a different Jesus. So what I'm saying is in a framework.
All right, David,
yeah.
I don't want to have a debate over this,
okay?
I just want to point out that if you want to reach people where they are, you got to know where they are.
I'm saying that the counterfeits that the devil is offering, if we use them, it actually can do more harm than good.
Okay, well, that's a difference of opinion.
Okay, I appreciate you answering the question.
I actually know several people that, in fact, how did C.S. Lewis come to faith? How did he come to faith? By talking to Tolkien,
but ultimately,
who wrote Lord of the Rings.
He was the tool but he was a person rather than Tolkien wasn't a counterfeit.
Look,
he was a tool.
let me put it
in the
this
hand of
way.
God.
Let me put it this way. Thankfully, God can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. And we're all crooked sticks. If we're going to say that we got to stay away from anything that isn't the Bible, you shouldn't read any other book. That sounds like the Jehovah's Witnesses to me. And every
we shouldn't
book,
use other things to try to point people to Jesus.
That's what we do.
That could be created by the devil to pull people away from Jesus.
I don't think C.S. Lewis was the devil.
No,
Okay?
I didn't say C.S. Lewis. Harry Potter, Marvel,
my son and I
DC.
are believers, and we're trying to use what is ubiquitous in the culture to point to Jesus. I'm not going to give up on the people that love all that stuff. I'm going to warn them, as we say in the first pages of the book, that some of these movies are not appropriate for younger children. But once they get older, instead of trying to isolate them from this stuff, we've got to inoculate them against this stuff by showing them what's in it and then showing them the truth. And we want to bring their friends along with them by saying, kid, man, if you love this character, look at who this character was patterned after, the character who is God that came to this earth to save you.
Well, I appreciate you answering my question.
Thank you, David.
I believe there's great spirit.
All right,
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for your work on the college campus. We need more people on the college campus. Yes, ma'am. By the way, you don't have to wait for somebody to sit down. Just come on up and... Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you.
What's your
very
name?
much, Frank. My name is Laura.
Say again?
Laura.
Laura, go ahead.
So, Christian apologetics is about defending Christianity. I was just wondering, in your opinion, what is the hardest aspect of Christianity to defend?
The hardest aspect of Christianity to defend. It depends on whether you mean emotionally or intellectually. Actually, intellectually, I don't think anything's hard to defend. Emotionally is the problem of evil. Okay? Why does God allow certain evils? Right? Why does God allow, babies to be killed or raped or, That's the hardest thing to answer from an emotional perspective. It's not hard to answer from an intellectual perspective. God knows all things, and if he's going to allow us to have free will, he can't stop us every time we try and exercise it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be free creatures. And God can redeem all the evil that's done here. This is a temporary situation. He can redeem it. And just because we can't see any good that comes from it, we know why we can't see any good that comes from it. Because we're stuck inside this small window sliver of time. And we have very limited perspective. God's outside of time. He can see the end from the beginning. He can see how all things ripple together to bring ultimate good, even when we can't. But emotionally, when you see what some people have dealt with, children, think about your own pastor, Pastor Robert, when his wife died. How many people in this church prayed she wouldn't? But we know that God can work all things together for good to those that love God and are called to his purpose. He doesn't say that all things are good. He says they work together for good. This is a temporary situation, ladies and gentlemen. Nobody's guaranteed 80 healthy years. We could go out at any minute, any one of us. And God can still bring good from it. All right? Thank you, Laura. Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
This is Carmen.
Carmen, go ahead.
Bringing this down, everybody. Okay, so I don't know that there's an answer for this really, but I have a thought in my mind that just comes up periodically, and I'm wondering what you think. So I'm a Christian. I believe the Bible, everything. How does it work though that how is it that God created something that could be fallen? What is the purpose of that?
What is the purpose of what now?
That God would create creation, everything, people that would fall, and that there would be a need for Christ. Why do that?
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I kind of struggle with that. Why create something that you have to then fix? What
Okay, I got it. Okay. You don't have to keep going. Okay.
You keep going.
All right. So sometimes people say, why did God put Adam and Eve in the garden when he knew they would sin? Right?
Yeah.
Well, thank God he did, because if he didn't, we wouldn't be moral creatures. if he doesn't give us the ability to make a free choice, then yeah, okay, we can't commit evil, but then we can't love either. So God gave us an opportunity. And we blew the opportunity, but of course God knew that would happen, and so he immediately set the plan in place to redeem us. But sometimes the question is put this way: why did God create people he knew would go to hell, say, for example? Okay? A similar question. Well, God could logically create a universe where nobody disobeys, right? Logically. But it's probably not actually achievable with free creatures. Because what God can't do is force free creatures to do what he wants, because that would be a contradiction, right? They wouldn't be free then. So it seems like the only kind of universe God could create would be a universe where people had freedom, but the maximum number of people were saved and the minimal number of people were lost. And only God knows what that number is. So he created this universe, and yet the people that are lost freely have decided to sin and freely have decided to reject the remedy for that sin. And God can still get his will done through free creatures, even atheists. For example, none of us would be sitting here right now if we didn't have unbelievers in our hereditary, right? Not everybody that is in your ancestry was a believer. You wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for them. God can also get his will done when people do evil, or when people even speak out against him. Like, for example, Richard Dawkins writes a book, The God Delusion. He says, you're deluded if you believe in God. Christian picks it up and goes, oh, I got to get an answer to that. And then goes and studies and gets closer to God because an atheist wrote something negative about God. Right? So even God can get his will done through even people that don't follow him, if that makes sense.
Yes.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Carmen. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
So,
What's your name?
my name's Seth.
Say again?
My name is Seth.
Seth, go ahead, sir.
Okay, so I've been trying to figure this one out.
You got to speak up, man, because I got no speaker up here, so go loud.
Sorry, I've been trying to figure this one out. So,
All right.
Jesus Christ came and he died for us, but Jesus Christ is going to come back from the dead.
He already has come back from the dead.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in my story, so he died for us, but he's going to come back to life.
Well, he's already come back to life.
Yes.
Right. He's going to come back to earth
life.
is the question, is the claim. Yeah. That's what we believe. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm having trouble explaining it.
All right. What's the question?
Where's the power in a death where he comes back to life when he's not going to die for certain forever?
Well, he did die. Sometimes people will say, I don't know if this is your question, oh, what's the big deal? So Jesus had a bad weekend, but, he came back to life. You may have heard some atheists say that. To which one guy said, oh, really? Why don't I take you, whip you, nail you to a cross, put a spear in your side, and have you hang there for 6 hours through that torturous process? Are you just going to say, well, look, I'm going to be resurrected anyway, so it's no big deal? No, you're going to say, I don't want to do that. That's awful. The punishment that God took on himself was the punishment we deserve. But since he took it for us, then we don't have to take that punishment, and we can not only be forgiven, we can be given his righteousness.
Maybe I can try to get at it this way. So
Okay.
I die for you. I can't come back. But Jesus knows he can come back. God knows he's going to bring him back.
Mm-hmm.
The power of that death, like where's the love in it?
The power is in not only the punishment, but the separation from God that Jesus experienced on the cross. There's only one place in the Bible that Jesus does not refer to God as my Father. It's when he's on the cross and he's quoting, I think, Psalm 22, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's a separation that Jesus has from God the Father that he never experienced before. Jesus was forsaken judicially by the Father. Jesus didn't deserve any of that punishment, but he voluntarily took it in order to free us from the punishment that we deserve. So, yeah, you might say, well, he's going to be resurrected. Yeah, he was resurrected, but he still had to go through basically hell to get there. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That's a little better.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name's Tony.
Yes, go ahead.
My question is so I try to share the gospel and the word with people at work, but sometimes just this comes pondering on my mind, and I was just like wondering if it's an actual thing or is it just a thing that man made up. Is because I know this is like the church and state thing, okay? But, I mean, does that also go, like, without, does that also, I mean, I don't know if that's actually a thing because...
Wait, that man made what up?
If man made that law of church and state thing, or, and...
What law in church and state? What do you mean?
I don't know. A long time ago, I heard something like this thing of a church and state, and I don't know if, like, is that also had to go with, like, you can get in trouble with sharing God at work and school?
I see what you're saying. Okay, all right, look.
Yeah, something.
You know, you're talking about can you share the gospel at work? Well, let's say when you're at...
But how can you do it without getting noticed or getting in trouble?
Well,
by your boss.
Actually, when you're at work, you ought to be giving your employer 100% effort. And if you are talking even about the gospel at work, distracting people from work, that would not be you being a good employee. Okay.
Well, what about at lunch
But you can
times?
go to lunch with people. On breaks, you can talk to them. But during work, you ought to be working. So that's my advice. Look, if you were the owner of the company, you wouldn't, even if you were a Christian, you would say, hey, during work hours, let's work. We could talk about this stuff during breaks or lunch or other times or after work, but let's work while we're here. There's a time and a place for everything, right?
Right.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks for wanting to witness to people at work. Too often people don't. Yes, sir, go ahead.
How's it going, sir? My name is Jace.
Jace, go ahead.
Currently, I'm trying to kind of discover Christianity, but unfortunately, I'm a little bit of an unbeliever currently, but that's why I want to ask you this question.
Sure.
So you were talking earlier about, I think 2 questions ago, how you kind of can't have free will, but also no evil at the same time. But from my understanding of Christianity, God is all-powerful. So is it not therefore possible for him to create a world with free will, but no evil?
Well, great question, Jace, because Christians don't believe God is all-powerful in the sense that he can violate his own nature, where he can do contradictory things. Like, for example, God can't create a square circle, right? Doesn't exist. Can't create a one-ended stick. Doesn't exist. Can't create a 5-sided triangle. Doesn't exist. Can't create an honest politician, right? There's some things that are too hard for God. If he could do those things, he wouldn't be God. So if people have free will, that means that God can't force them against their will to do something, because then they wouldn't have free will. So the point here is he's all-powerful with regard to his nature, but he's not all-powerful in the sense that he can violate his nature or do contradictory things, because those things are just impossible. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir, kind of.
Okay.
I think that's just hard to understand as a human, I guess.
Well, sure. But you can understand why there can't be a square circle, right?
To me, like when I hear through God all things are possible, that means all things.
No, it doesn't mean impossible things are possible. Things that are really impossible, like a 5-sided triangle, or a person that has free will but is forced to do everything, right? That would be contradictory. God can't make 2 + 2 = 12, right? He can't both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same sense, because that would be logically contradictory, and I think God's nature is the ground of logic, just like it's the ground of mathematics. So God can't be unloving because God is God. Now, he might punish people, but that's part of love. Okay? So when we say all-powerful, we don't mean that, he can do these logically impossible things that would violate his nature, or these mathematically crazy things. He can't do that. No one can. All right?
Thank you for
Thanks,
answering
Jace. Appreciate it. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Joshua.
Joshua, go ahead.
I have 3 questions.
All right. Well, I don't know if we get time for all 3, but ask one. Go ahead.
First one's a tricky one.
Oh, we're almost done. You're setting this up? Okay, thanks. For the last question, I'll hear it. Check that out. That's pretty good. Thanks, Manny. Go ahead.
The first one is a tricky question. The second one's
Just
problematic.
go with the first one. Go ahead.
Okay.
False. Okay, next. No, go ahead.
Can God be known from logic?
Can God be known from logic? What do you mean by that?
Well, all of your claims were presupposed that logic was the foundation of it. So therefore, does that mean logic is above God, or are we putting
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, I think logic is grounded in God's nature, just like morality is. Mm-hmm. So he is logic. He is organized in that way. He is organized, probably not the right word. His nature is logical. So it's not above him. He is. It's not like there's a moral law above God. God is righteous. He is the standard. The buck has to stop somewhere. It stops with God's nature.
So then are we using God's nature to explain God's nature?
Well, he is the self-existent eternal one. So he is the ground of all being, yes. Now, we know God by analogy. We don't know him directly. So, so much of what we read in the Bible is analogous to God. Even some of the metaphors that are used. God's, the eyes of the Lord go to and fro. Does God really have eyes? No, it's just an expressive way of saying that God sees everything. Right. Okay.
So then my second question would be, you said that miracles are a sign to point to God, but then there's all these delusions that Satan brings about. So how do we discern between delusions and miracles?
Yeah, good question. A satanic sign. In chapter 8 of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, we have a whole section on that. The short answer is God's signs point to truth and goodness and bring glory to God. Satan's signs are deceptive and do not point to Jesus, do not point to God. They're trying to get you away from Jesus. So that's one of the ways you can discover the difference.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Joshua. Yes, sir. What's your name?
Manny.
Manny, go ahead, sir.
What do we say as believers to skeptics that slam God and say, like in the Old Testament, he's all about violence and murder and unjust, and he's a bully? Like, how do we?
Well, the first thing you should ask is, what do you mean by unjust?
Well, say he wiped or murdered or commanded like children and.
Okay, but the question is why is that wrong? If there's no God, why would that even be wrong? In other words, the atheists are stealing a standard from God to argue against him, right? So the first question I might ask is, why do you think it's wrong to kill anyone? Where are you coming up with that? You're assuming a moral standard that in atheism, there is no moral standard. You don't have a moral standard because there's no purpose, there's no objective to life, there's no standard of righteousness. It's just your opinion. So in one sense, the atheists are stealing from God while they're arguing against him. That's the subject of the book, Stealing from God. But it's fair for an atheist to say, okay, you say your God is a God of love. Why does he say kill the Canaanites? Right. Okay, right. Okay, good question. Well, one thing you can do, in fact, we often get this question. One thing you can point out is the fact that when God decides that certain people in the Old Testament should die, is that something that he does arbitrarily? Like, for example, The first point I just made is there is no God. Why is any Old Testament atrocity wrong? Nothing's an atrocity if there is no God. But then you want to ask, is God arbitrary or does he give reasons for judging people in the Old Testament? The Canaanites. What were the Canaanites doing? They were not only sacrificing their children to Molech, they were doing a number of other awful things. And for 400 years, God warned them, you need to get out of the land. In fact, Genesis 15:6 says the iniquity of the Amorite hasn't come to the right level yet. God is going to judge them later, and he does. Also, in fact, this is the god Molech. They would put the baby on the hot metal arms of this Canaanite god because it's heated up, and they would basically watch their children sizzle to death. In fact, it's not just the Bible that talks about this. Plutarch, a first century Greek writer, says that in the villages where this was done, the drummers would play their drums louder so that the parents couldn't hear the screams of their own children. You know, on every college campus I go to, I always hear, hey, why doesn't God stop the evil in the world? Well, here's an instance in the Old Testament where he's going to stop evil, and the atheists are complaining about it. Right? In fact, that's the next point. Why complain that God doesn't stop evil, but then complain when he does? Right? Also, what we need to point out here is God committing murder by ending lives on earth. Can God murder anyone? No, we can be charged with murder because we don't own life. God is the owner of life. He can take life whenever he wants. It's not murder for him if he decides that someone needs to die. In fact, everybody's going to die at some point. It's up to God when that happens. And if Christianity's true, people don't die, they just change location. Right? They go from this life to the next life. He doesn't guarantee us 80 years of healthy life. He could take us out at 80 years old or 2 years old. It's up to him. And finally, the Old Testament theocracy where this occurred was unique and temporary. It was not the ideal for all time, but the means to a promised new covenant. Let me say one other thing about this. This was not, as the atheists will say, as genocide. And probably the best book on this is by Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster?, where God says God was concerned with sin, not ethnicity. In fact, as we read in the Old Testament prophets, they, with God, were angered about Israel's disobedience and threatened divine judgment on Israel and Judah more often than they did pagan nations. In other words, God killed the Israelites when they sinned too. It wasn't like, okay, kill all these foreigners. In fact, what happened at the golden calf? 3,000 people were killed that day. It's judgment. It's not arbitrary, just killing people for no reason. And by the way, with regard to killing the women and the children, in this book, Paul Copan points out that it couldn't have always been literal if it ever was literal. Why? Because if you go to Deuteronomy 7, where it says wipe everybody out, the very next verse says, and then don't intermarry with them. And you go, how could you intermarry with a group you just wiped out? This must mean something else. And in the ancient Near East, they often used this hyperbolic language to say, destroy these. They would say, annihilate everyone, destroy everyone. But it didn't really mean literally everyone. It meant to defeat them soundly or push them out of the land. And if you look at stela after stela, stela is a war bragging stone that ancient cultures would put up. Israel never put them up, but the Assyrians and the Egyptians put them up. They would say, we wiped everybody out, when in fact they really didn't. It was just a bragging thing. But if you want to go further, get that book right there.
Thanks, Frank.
All right, thank you. All right, last couple. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Andrew. Thank you for coming, Dr. Turek.
Yes, sir, thank you.
I had a question regarding using things from the culture to reach Christians.
Uh-huh.
Is there a line that you would draw? For example, before Christ, I watched things like Game of Thrones, which would not be appropriate for any Christian to watch. Can someone use something like that or 50 Shades of Grey to also point people to Christ? Or is there somewhere where you draw a line and say, this is too far?
I think that's a case-by-case basis. That's going to be a disputable matter, as Paul would say in Romans 14, right? Even if you think, let's go back to Harry Potter for a second. If you think, well, I want my kid into this, I think you should still tell your kid the storyline. so he can or she can talk to other kids that do watch it. Then you have a way in. Look, what did Paul do when he went to Mars Hill? Did he just quote the Bible to people?
No, he also quoted philosophers of their day.
Yeah,
I guess
he quoted the Greek philosophers.
What he quoted though wasn't in contradiction with the Bible.
No,
so
actually, what he did is instead of in Zeus we live and move and have our being, Paul said in Yahweh we live and move and have our being. So he transitioned what they believed into a Christian context, and that's exactly what we're trying to do when we talk about movies.
Is there a danger of one giving their imprimatur on someone going to those sources that could actually lead them away from Christ, though?
Oh, anything's possible. Yeah, I'm sure it is, right? But we're trying to win as many people to Christ as possible. And Paul said, I become all things to all people so I could win some. And he used pagan philosophers and pagan poets to reach the pagans. And so I think advisedly we need to do that as well. Now, it might not be cut out for everyone, right? Maybe some people can't do it. I get it. Personally, I'm not attracted to any of the movies. It doesn't bother me at all. I'm not going to suddenly become an Iron Man worshiper, okay? Right? So I think we have to make proper judgments based on the constitution of the person. And if we can use those stories to try and win people to Christ, by all means, we ought to do it.
Should we do it also giving warning about the stories, though?
Sure.
For example, if someone were to use Harry Potter. I read it twice as a kid before Christ.
Yeah.
And I know how it had a negative effect on my life, and it does on anyone who reads it.
Mm-hmm.
When we use if we use those things, should we not also warn them about it? And is that
sure? If you think it's going to be a problem, I can tell you my kids read it and they're fine. So it really depends. I mean, these depends on how you set it up. This is fantasy. This isn't real. For Christians who really came hard against Harry Potter, and I leave it up to parents. Look, parents, whatever you decide, I'm going to support. But think about Harry Potter. No sex, no swearing. It's just a story about good versus evil. That's what it is.
There's also witchcraft.
Oh, okay, yeah, but it's not the kind of real witchcraft. This is stuff that comes out of J.K. Rowling's head.
But she actually studied witchcraft, and there's real witchcraft in it, like real curses spoken in it, real spells spoken. So because I read it twice, like I said,
okay,
I'm a little more familiar with it perhaps than you are.
Okay.
That there can be a danger in it if we don't equally warn. Like I would say, if you were to use something for that, you would have to equally warn the person.
Fine.
Kind of like in Ezekiel, it says if you don't warn them, the blood's on your hands. So if you were to ever use something from that, and I don't even know that we should, because I would have to say, you'd have to avoid it like a 10-foot plague. Mormons might say 20 things that I'd agree with, but I would never point someone towards Mormonism to point them to Christianity.
You should have people read the Book of Mormon. Because when a Mormon comes to your door, you want to know what's in there.
Yeah, I don't know that you need to read the entire book to know the beliefs and teachings.
Well,
but
look,
what I'm saying is there is a danger in pointing people to things that
Let me just ask you a question. What would you say if you went to a doctor and you said, look, I got a disease, and the doctor said, I don't study disease. I just study health. Would you go to a different doctor?
So I personally do witness to Mormons, and I do study the things that they believe. But I don't know that it requires you to read the entire book. Just like you don't have to read the entirety of Harry Potter to know there's enough darkness in it to point people away from it.
Fine, but would you go to a doctor that didn't study disease?
Would I go to a doctor that didn't study disease? If I had a disease, no.
Yeah, you would go to a doctor that did study disease. That's all I'm saying.
But I wouldn't go to a doctor that said, here's this disease, you should try it out.
I'm not saying...
So that would be my conflict with that.
Okay.
But thank you for answering your question.
All right, thank you. Yes, ma'am. Final question.
Thank you
for
everything.
Yes, ma'am. What's your name?
Sandy.
Hey, Sandy.
And I got mad the other day and I told the devil I hated him.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a sin?
I think God's rooting you on. Do you think God loves Satan? Depends on what you mean by love, right? He knows that Satan is an eternal rebel because he's outside of time. He knows he's never coming back. So the question is, what do you mean by hate?
Hate evil and Satan's evil?
You should hate evil. Yeah, you should. But God also says love our enemies, right?
And Satan's our enemy?
Yeah, but you know he's never going to be redeemed because he's Satan. Okay, so the question is, how do you love your enemy? How do you love your enemy if he's a human being?
Through Christ?
Yeah, it doesn't mean you approve of everything they do, right? That wouldn't be love, that'd be enablement. Okay? So you're going to oppose Satan, and you're not going to love him in the sense you would a person that could be redeemed, who's still made in the image of God, right? So Satan seems to be in a category all by himself, in my view anyway. So to say you hate Satan or hate what he does, Satan's still a creature of God. And by the way, he has good qualities. He just uses them for evil, right? He has mind, emotion, and will. Those are good things, but he uses them for evil. So we can still say metaphysically Satan is good in that sense, but we still need to oppose him because he's doing evil and he's never going to repent. We already know that. So we have to, in that sense, oppose him. But it really depends on what you mean by the word hate. You know, the Psalms use the word hate. I hate evil. I hate evildoers. Okay? It's a strong way of saying I oppose what you're doing. And you should oppose what he's doing, right? Yes.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. All right. All right, folks. Thanks for hanging out. I'll go back to the book table for a few minutes if anyone has any questions, but I can't hang around too long because my flight is at 6 a.m. But let's pray, shall we? Heavenly Father, we're blessed with all the evidence that you have given us. If we just open our eyes and look around, we can see there's a creator, a designer, a moral lawgiver. We can see that there's wisdom and design behind the Bible. We can see that these people were eyewitnesses and they told us what happened, and that we can trust in you for our salvation, and that we should reach out to others, particularly in this period known as Christmas, to try and show people the love of Christ and the real meaning of life, which is to know you and then to make you known. Give us the opportunities this Christmas season to do that. Make us have a heart for other people. Give us opportunities and give us the right questions to ask and the right things to say. I also pray that you'd protect Pastor Robert and Kathy as they get some refreshment. Bring everybody back here Wednesday night for another great teaching. In Christ's name, amen.